And we're back with another episode of Café con Chisme. I'm Seb.
And I'm Yaz.
And if you are here, you know that this is actually part 2. We have a special crossover. Latinx people love a good crossover. I mean, the Latin boom of the 90s, Ricky Martin, Selena, anyway. We're doing a little crossover today with our dear friends of Anzaldúing It. So welcome, Angélica and Jack. Hey. If you are just tuning in, you should go check out their podcast, Anzaldúing It, because part 1 of this conversation is actually on their, channel? On their platform?
Yeah.
So go listen to that and then come back here. Or you can, I don't think you have to listen to them in order. You can listen to them out of order, I suppose.
Yeah.
But we wanted to do this special kind of collab, talking a lot about the conversations that both of our shows have been addressing in our recent episodes, having to do with anti-Blackness in the wake of the protests, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and countless other Black folks who have died at the hands of police in the past weeks and years. And so I think to the question, so we wanted to kind of focus in, similar to the episode that we did with Anzaldúing It on their show, is talking about how are we addressing anti-Blackness, which is racism, right? How are we addressing anti-Blackness as racism, as white supremacy in our communities as non-Black Latinx people, especially in the wake of everything that's happening and seeing such really violent anti-Black sentiment and rhetoric coming from Latinx folks, white Latinx folks, brown Latinx folks, folks of all different colors and
all
legal statuses.
Yeah.
Right. And so, more of a conversation on white Latinidad in the other episode, if you want to kind of listen to that first. But today, for our episode, we really want to think about this question that keeps coming up in terms of the what about us, right? Latinx people saying, what about us? What about the kids in cages? What about, immigrant rights? What about, or having signs that say things like Latinx for Black lives or Latinos for Black lives? So the question that's going to be guiding today's conversation with the 4 of us is really thinking of how do we as a community practice anti-Blackness, and how can we begin to address undoing those practices, right? And changing and hopefully transforming and revolutionizing in the context of liberation for all people. So that's kind of the
beautiful Seb.
intro. Thank you. We've been doing this for a little bit now. It's not my first rodeo. So with that said, I don't know, Yaz, if you'd like to add anything else as we open it up.
I think this is a perfect time to introduce our beautiful, beautiful, beautiful guest. Dun, 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 dun. Well, actually, they're introducing themselves.
Popcorn.
Right. Also, we're recording this on Zoom, so we're very much Brady bunching it right now.
Yeah.
So
I know. I'm all, hey.
I hope we're all placed in the same places on all of these.
There's no one else I'd rather be on a square with.
That's right. You want to go first, Angélica? Or are we doing introductions?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you don't know who we are, hi, my name's Angélica Becerra. I'm an artist and a scholar of political graphics. My pronouns are she, hers. I also answer to queen. I answer to boo most of the time. So just letting you know what will get my attention. And Jack and I have a podcast. It's called Anzaldúing It. And it's a very queer Latinx podcast. We're basically 2 best friends. We have queer Latinx woes, and we talk about relationships, astrology. I am Walter Mercado's daughter, so...
I was like, really?
That's how rumors start. Maybe I shouldn't say that. But, Walter Mercado is like my padrino when it comes to astrology. So that's definitely who I get it from. But yeah, that's me.
Hi, for those of you who don't know who I am. Jack Caraves, pronouns he, him, they, them, él. You had to add in, like, you know, the English and Spanish. I'm, I guess, beyond being a podcaster with Angélica and Anzaldúing It, I am a professor of women and gender sexuality studies at San Jose State. Still feels weird to talk or use that title. But my work and like what I'm interested looks at both the trans or at the intersection of what it means to be trans and Latinx in this moment. So I think that's pretty much it. I have like 12 animal children.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, like we said, we're really grateful and excited to have you here. I wanted to start before though, with that question that I posed, some disclaimers that y'all said on your show that I think just in case this is the first one you're listening to, 2 things to keep in mind. One is that this conversation captures the consciousness that we're at right now, right? So things can change, we can learn, we can grow, we can, you know, kind of reflect on things or whatever. So this is where you're catching us in this moment. And then second, if we, you know, do need to be corrected, or that if we say something that maybe doesn't, you know, resonate or comes off, however, we are also all have agreed that we are welcome to be called in with compassion and restorative justice, and are all ears if folks want to dialogue or add stuff to the conversation. You know, we said we're not the experts on everything here, right? Like that's what the whole point of you're catching this conversation in this moment. And our only goal really is to continue growing and being better with this stuff, to hopefully, you know, do the work that we all need to do in this moment. So, yeah, so let's open it up with the question that I posed earlier. How do we as a community practice anti-Blackness? We mentioned some examples earlier, but kind of exploring that a little bit to ultimately start to talk about how do we dismantle all of that as well. So whoever would like to start off.
Big question.
I feel like this conversation specifically, right, is posed like as a response to our community's response to Black lives, right? So we know that is like multi layered, and there's a lot of different avenues we could go there in each direction about how that's come up. But I think for starters, we can start real basic, right? The idea of Latinx for Black lives. I think we can start there.
Let's start
just so we can preface it and we can continue trickle down into all of the other things y'all fucked up about. No, just like.
What about compassion? Yes.
That's Capricorn compassion.
That means I love you. No, just kidding.
James Bond.
Okay, so
yes.
Latinx for Black lives. The inherent nature of that comment is stating that Black folks are not a part of the Latinx community, and that there is a separation. And I don't know if this is happening more in LA. I can't speak on the East Coast experience, but I've seen this a lot in Los Angeles because of the demographics of Latinx people. I feel like there's this I feel like there is a misconception that somehow Latinx is parallel to brown, and that thus meaning that it is separate from Black. And so while Latinx for Black lives is one of the, I feel like, you know how well-meaning white women will be the death of us? I feel like well-meaning Latinx people will be the death of us too. Like Latinx for Black lives was coming from a place of like, I'm trying to have your back, but in doing so, further marginalizing and othering Black people while doing that. So
wow.
Start there.
Very well put.
Damn, all right.
Yeah, this is coming for all of you.
She can't.
I know. I feel like this just kicked in right now.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Because I've seen that on plenty of people's feeds in the last few weeks. People who are, según social justice warriors. So let's unpack.
I do want to say a word to the newcomers to social justice work from us veterans.
I wouldn't say that, but okay.
Well, I've been at the game for a bit, but I do have an FBI agent assigned to me.
You better work.
But, I think as someone who has participated actively, put their body on the line before, I think a lot of folks are definitely motivated to do so now. So I do think it's my responsibility to say that your inability to take direction from Black people is showing, right?
That's there. We can go now. I mean,
thank you. Mic drop. I'm out.
Yeah, we just got onto Café con Chisme and are just like,
I was like, wait,
we're warmed up. We're warmed up. But I do think that's a really, at least from within our own community, I'm seeing that a lot. That's probably one of the biggest symptoms of anti-Blackness, right? That we don't take direction from the community that's calling for us to be in solidarity, not to lead. We're not leading, right? Especially if you're non-Black, you're not at the center. Just get used to that. You are not leading this movement. You're taking direction from the people whose lives are at stake. And so I think that when we join on the ground efforts, when we join the protests, right? When your body is actively there, you need to be aware of how your body language is like 70% of communication. So if your body is centering itself, whether it's through, there's so many ways in which I've seen the Latinx community specifically do this, but I will say going to a protest and documenting it, right? Putting people at risk. That's one way, because FBI tactics are to use face recognition software on photos. I definitely will be the one on here to say I'm the anonymous person here, I'm pro hacker. It does happen. It is real. Anonymous is our friend. So I do want to say that, when you're going to a protest and performatively being an ally, that's harming, not helping. And also do some homework, see what the Black Lives Matter movement is calling for you to do. They're very clear on the direction they want others to take who are not Black. And part of that direction does not include you necessarily, right? And so I think that that needs to be said if we're talking about our own, right? Mm-hmm. If we're talking about calling each other in, I'm take a seat and really think about not you, but how you can take direction. Because so much of social justice work that I've done actively has been to take direction from other people. It has not been to take the lead on something. I've never done that. So just reminding gently that taking direction is probably the most you can do. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Didn't mean to come so hard, sorry.
No, that's needed.
Okay.
I think even last time we were even saying that, and if you're confused, if you're not sure what we mean by that, listen to Black women, listen to Black trans women, listen to Black femmes, listen to Black disabled people, and listen, right? Listen, and like Angélica said, if it is take a seat, then take a seat. If it is to be that your body is needed on the front line, every person's gonna know that what their call is on their own, right? But But yeah, I think that's what we mean. Listen to Black podcasts, you know what I mean? Don't just listen to us. I think there's tons of, and maybe we should put together, I can do that, a resource on the Instagram of who to check out. But yeah, I think that's that's part of it, right? Is taking lead from those who have been doing this and are doing the hardest of this work.
Mm-hmm. And maybe on the other side of that coin, silence when people are experiencing racism is anti-Black. And I think that in our community, right, silence is almost a response that can either be petty because you think that the issues of your community are not being highlighted enough. So you're well, if we're not talking about kids in cages, I'm not going to show up for Black lives. It could be that, or it could just be well, that's not my experience. They're over there. They're, there's this negative representation on the media of people looting, and they think that's what it is. So they're I'm not going to get involved because I'm very invested in this good immigrant identity that I have for myself. It could be so many reasons why people are silent right now, and I don't want to assume, but I do want to say that if you're silent, really question why. right? If you are lacking the words, that's one thing. If you're educating yourself in order to respond, that's one thing. But if you're silent because it's comfortable, because you don't have to say something, and you don't, that's where I would say, like, question that, right? But silence is so harmful. That's like, I think for me, especially on my, like, I'll call in my community, which I have multiple, but the artist community, I've been very surprised to see not many Latinx artists speak up about Black Lives Matter and about Black lives in general. I've been really saddened to see Latinx artists not representing or centering Black voices in their work. And I think for me, that's been honestly shocking, right? Because artists are usually supposed to reflect our times, right? As Nina Simone called us to do. So if we're supposed to reflect the times, why are we not reflecting what's going on? Why are we not using our gift as artists to represent what's happening? Like, that's literally our job. So I think for me, like, if you're an artist or if you're somebody who's creative that is listening, what are you doing? Right? Are you reflecting? If you're not, then really question why.
Absolutely.
Right. I think, go ahead, yes.
I just, like, one thing that came up, Angélica, with what you're saying about kids in cages, right? Like, I think the first thing to note is that there are Black folks in cages and there are Black children in cages. And I think that this assumption, again, like, that it is a quote unquote brown issue. And I use that term brown because it's coming up a lot on social media, on signs and things like that. And it's kind of like this brown, either brown and Black unity or like brown versus Black, right? So I feel like it's important to note that the immigrant struggle, or like what we talk about when we're talking about like immigration reform and ending ICE and all those things, like that is very much a Black issue also. And it encompasses Black people, and Black people are suffering at the hands of that system as well. And so that in of itself is like a fallacy, right? Like, well, what about, like, if you're not showing up for this, then you're not, it's like, well, you should be doing both, first of all, and either.
And they're tied together, right? Like, ultimately, because we're not going to abolish ICE if we don't first abolish cages, which, altogether, whether it's for immigrants or it's for citizens or a bunch of people in general. So it's like, I mean, abolition was something that existed way long before the detention centers we see now, right? Or the current most current version of the immigrants' rights movement. So to say that these are separate things, one is, again, like you're saying, a fallacy, is not true. And these things are tied together. And then Black folks have been fighting for this for much longer, right? And have kind of set the path, or have set the stage, essentially, right, to talk about abolition in the way that so many immigrant rights folks talk about abolition, right? And maybe not in those words, but to say, like, that abolish ICE or get rid of ICE or, etc. Like, at the end of the day, right, like, this is a system. And that's the thing I talked a little bit, I think, on the last episode we recorded about, like, ultimately, like this larger system is what is the problem, not these two different communities, right? Like, the system is the problem. So how can we show up to because ultimately what we need to do is dismantle this larger system, right? Dismantle white supremacy, dismantle capitalism. Like, those two things are intertwined, patriarchy, et cetera, but I lost my train of thought, but
we got you.
But yeah, it's just a trip to think that, like, these are two separate things. They're not two separate things. They're tied together, and like,
we were told the idea that, like, Black liberation at some point has nothing to do with the liberation of people in general. Right. Like, somehow that is a separate thing that like exists in, like, a separate universe that is not going to, like, benefit us overall.
Right. Like, it's Black liberation at the expense of, which is not true at all.
And, like, I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Is the U.S. not a cage? Like when Los Tigres del Norte philosophized.
I know.
I mean, that's what my mom always said. Está en la jaula de oro.
Yes, our philosophers of our community, Los Tigres del Norte, said La Jaula de Oro. But before that, Maya Angelou wrote, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, bitch. Like, you know, like I'd like to think that the two are connected, that the cage that we're naming is not a cage that's like just for us to understand. It's like we're all in a fucking cage. Maybe the bars are different, but, you know, we are definitely experiencing this, right? And so I think that while the intentions are good to call attention to the specific struggles of the Latinx or the migrant community more broadly, it's okay to show up for Black lives right now. That's what we're fucking prioritizing, because that is the minimum, honestly. Like, and I don't know why I'm angrier on this episode than I was on the last one, but I'm just like, y'all, like... And it takes a lot to get me angry. So I think I'm just at a point where I no longer want to hear excuses. I want to hear action items. So, you know, if this hurts your feelings,
like,
sorry.
And I think all of this too, we've said it again. And I mean, we said it in the other episode too, but again, like this division makes it seem like there's not Black people who exist in the Latinx community. So again, it's further marginalizing that population. The erasure of that leads to the erasure of that population. And it's like, these things are not mutually exclusive, because newsflash, being Latinx is not a race, right? Like, which it's like, it's not a race. And I think that we often, again, we're sold this idea that it is, or because of the way Latinidad is sold and packaged to us, right? That it is the race or it's something different, which it is, right? And a lot of the reason that it is because it's tied to like xenophobia. It's tied to right. Yeah. So there's these other reasons why, but again, like it doesn't. Like, we need to, I don't know, I just feel like we're in this moment of like, get off your fucking soapbox. And yes, you've had it bad, whatever, because of whatever fucking reasons, but just acknowledge, right, that like, if we don't acknowledge that, it's like coming back to don't all lives matter type of thing. When you say, why not us? Why don't Black people show up to like the immigration protests? One, they do. But ultimately, if we don't acknowledge that Black lives matter, then we can't acknowledge that immigrant life, like non-Black immigrant lives matter. We can't acknowledge that other lives matter, right? So it's not until we acknowledge that Black lives matter and all Black lives, right, that we can dismantle these larger systems.
Yeah, and I think that, and just to kind of add on to that, is to your point, Jack, it's because we are working within white supremacy, right? And so if that is the frame, if that is like what we're all immersed in, I think that's even another way to think about it as to why Black people's struggles need to be centered, right, and prioritized. I wanted to add something as well in terms of, you know, Jack, you reminded us, and we've been saying this too, right, that Latinx is not a race. It refers to, it's like a pan-ethnic term that can involve or include all races. But, you know, if you're listening and you're not, as a non-Black Latinx person, you know, and you might think like, well, you know, I don't know if I've had like extreme racism, or I don't know if I've had it so bad, or, you know, one, that's privilege. So let's listen to the last episode and explore that. But second, you know, we are exposed to messages about race as Latinx people from the beginning, right? Yes. And I'm speaking, you know, like Yaz and I were raised, both of our parents are immigrants. Our dad is from Chile. Our mom is Mexican. Like we grew up in Whittier, which, you know, has a lot of different types of Latinx people, but also like a lot of immigrant or first gen. And so, you know, we hear things about, if you heard things about like, oh, you know, Güerita or Güerito, if that was your nickname or the nickname of someone in your family. Yeah, right. Or like, they talk about, if you've said things like, well, I'm white passing or light skin, or you start using like the food qualifiers, like, oh, I'm caramel, or I'm like, you know what
food
I mean? Because
qualifiers, yeah.
there are people there who do that, and then thinking
Café con mucha leche. That's really
yes. Non-dairy, please, non-dairy, because she can't. Or on the other extreme of that, hearing things about like, someone being prieto or prieta, or even, using the word indio as like a derogatory offense towards someone, right? Whether it's from our parents or our grandparents or family relatives, whoever. So I say that to remind us that we are not outside of the conversations around race, and that even if they are not, along the black-white binary of whether you're black or white, we are all very well informed, whether we're conscious of it or not, of having positions and stances that we take, again, consciously or not unconsciously, about race within Latinx communities that could include anti-blackness as well as like colorism, depending, and the other part that I wanted to add to that is that is a reminder of why we say race is socially constructed, right? That there is nothing biologically inherent that marks us as different besides the fact that phenotypes, right? That skin color or that facial features look different amongst different people.
Come through, Dr. Seb.
Thanks. I took a few notes that I wanted to get to. And so I say all of those things to remind us, right, that our understanding of race within ourselves and within the people around us is always subjective. It's always relational, right? And it's often measured in relation to the proximity or distance to whiteness or blackness, right? And I think that molds and shapes like how we experience the world. So I want to kind of contextualize that, because I think I also see a lot of like scapegoating, or like, well, no, but like my family's not racist, or like, oh, it's just jokes, or like, oh, I don't care if they call me güerita or negrito or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, and I think that's another fallacy that we're trying to debunk here, right? Is that we don't interact with race in the same way that, or in this kind of more general way that we're talking about, with especially all the conversations that have come up in the last month or so. Yeah.
That's another form of silence. I'm so glad you said that. Being able to address it on your feed, but then going home to like a carne asada and not being able to call out. We have an episode on our podcast called Calling Out Your Racist Tios, and that includes anti-Indigenous sentiment, that includes anti-Blackness, that includes anti-anything. I mean, I have anti-Arabness in my family, and that's very deep. So really thinking about, okay, like what are some of the things I could be doing beyond social media to really just like begin to call folks in. So I'm so glad you said that, because I think that that's part of the work that people don't want to do, but it's necessary for us to do. That's one way you could be working right now, actually.
Right. And I had this conversation, and I don't know how y'all feel about this, but I had this conversation with one of my friends the other day, and he was kind of like, I don't see how you could, because we have some aunts that we just don't speak to anymore because of their like deep-rooted beliefs in anti-Blackness and, Trump supporters, just anti-everything or whatever. I feel like they were like, they couldn't wrap their head around how I would let like issues of politics like get between me and my relationship to blood family members, right? I think it's important too when we talk about like calling out our family members in that sense, right? Because when I was having that conversation with my friend, we're talking about like, I can't believe you would risk like severing ties with a blood relative. Like those are your people. And my response was like, Black people are my people too. And also blood relatives don't mean, like, it was just such and I understand everyone's on their own journey, but like to accept that like, these are the people that I was born into, this family, right? And I'm like, now given this little group of folks that are my family members, and therefore I have to just accept everything that they do and say, like, in my opinion, it's homophobic and like, I don't know.
Unrealistic.
And unrealistic, because you're also not centering yourself in situations where people don't have the privilege of being like, yeah, my family is this, and like my family is like just gonna support me through everything, and we argue about like being vegan or not, but like not about my actual humanity, you know? Like,
Yes.
I don't know, that shit was just twisted, and I think like we really have to take a step back and we're not telling y'all to like stop talking to your mom or your dad over shit, but I'm just telling you like what's at stake if we don't push back. And like people are always asking like, well, how can we get involved if we're not like you know, at demonstrations, or we don't have the language, or like things like that. Like starting at home is the bare minimum labor, and if it's hard on you, like, baby, this shit isn't supposed to be easy, and obviously we want you to be in a situation that's safe and like you are not putting yourself in danger. But I also want to encourage you to like lean into the discomfort and know that this type of shit takes, you know, courage, and it's not supposed to be comfortable and it's not supposed to be easy, but that's the only way that we can actually get people to start realizing like, oh, okay. Because before this, I thought my child was okay with me being this way, you know?
Right. And I think a lot of that has to do too with Latinx families and maybe not just Latinx families, but like respectability within like the family, in terms of like, don't stir the pot at the Christmas table, or don't say the thing that your racist Thea is going to get mad at, you know what I mean? Or don't femme out in front of your cop cousin, like whatever, you know, like those are, and I granted, you know, we all are, we have multiple experiences and we have to be strategic as to like when and where and how. But if you felt like this is your moment to start speaking, or, you know, like this is not, I don't think, and I get it as someone who has intense anxiety issues and whatever, and I hate confrontations, but that this is the time to push yourself into that discomfort. Again, I'm not asking anyone to put themselves in danger, but this is not the time to be like, I'll deal with this next time, or maybe, you know, right now is not the moment. Like, this is the moment, because if not now, like, I don't know what you're waiting for at this point. Right. Like, I don't know what it's gonna take for you to feel compelled to act on it.
Yeah, and think about the folks that are in constant discomfort because of who they are, right? Whether they're Black or, you know, whatever parts of their identity, right? Like, I mean, folks are constant in discomfort at the expense of them, like, you know, being who they are because other people are too uncomfortable. So yeah, part of the internal work is being uncomfortable in becoming aware of how, again, we're complicit, or how we're perpetuating these things unconsciously or consciously. And then also being in uncomfortable situations with rocking the boat in our families, right? And like that, how else are people going to learn? Because they're not getting that from the people they're engaging with, because obviously they probably believe the same things, right? And so I think, and, you know, even in moments when I've had conversations with family members where I felt they weren't hearing me, even if they were like pushing back, I think over time I would see small changes, right? Or I would at least see, like, I shared this on one of our last Anzaldúing It episodes, but like, you know, this shit runs deep. Like, my mom will still use like say Indio or something like that in a very derogatory way, and I'm like, bitch, you Mayan, like you know, like anyway, it's internalized, right?
Of course.
But I always call it out, and she's like, even now I'll call it out if she uses it, and she's like, oh, I knew you were gonna say something, and I'm like, then why the fuck are you still saying it? Or like, you know, like it doesn't stop me. And and like it's annoying to her, but it's not gonna stop me from like calling her out or calling her in, right? And trying to tell her why this thing is not okay, or why it's racist or fucked up. You know, with some folks it's gonna take a lot more work, but yeah, I think being uncomfortable is part of the work. Being uncomfortable is part of growth. It's part of pursuing or getting to a place where we can dismantle these things. I mean, this thing is not going to be toppled over by some politician, right? Or some president or some shit like that. It's going to take like more often than not, it's going to be in the conversations, in the difficult conversations that we have on a day-to-day with person to person. And it's not about trying to sell somebody an idea, but it's about like hearing, right? Like trying to hear each other out, but also being like, well, we need to, like, we're just asking for people to be looked at as humans and like to be able to live in a dignified way. So
and like this idea of allyship, right? Like I prefer the term co-conspiratorship, but if we are owning the term co-conspiratorship, then that means like in spaces where Black folks aren't, like it's time for you to do the work. And even in spaces where Black folks are, right? Like the burden is going to be on them 24/7. Like that's just the way that racism works. So the idea that to be a true co-conspirator is like you are not from the outside looking in, willing to dip your toe when it's comfortable for you, but to when no one else is around but you and someone else that's doing fucked up shit, like that's the time for you to speak up and do something about it, because that's how we like promote or do incremental change. Like that's the only way it happens. It doesn't only happen on Instagram, baby, with hashtags, you know?
Right.
Yes.
I want to add to that because we didn't talk about it too much. You know, that oftentimes in these conversations about the what about us and the Latinx or Black lives, right, there is a complete omission of a gender analysis and like of a class analysis.
Yes.
And, you know, we mentioned this on the other episode that we did with y'all, but as a reminder, right, like the number of trans Black women who are being murdered continues to rise.
Yes.
Right. Black trans women and Latinx and Latina trans women too. But I think at the forefront, really, it's Black trans women who are disproportionately murdered by cops, but also by by other
people in general. Yeah.
Men in general, women in some cases. And I want to preface this by saying like there's been a lot of conversation about like homophobia and transphobia within the Black community. We're not here to speak on that because that is not our conversation to have. That's like an intra-community conversation that should, that is not our place. But our place is to address the homophobia and transphobia within the non-Black Latinx communities because it is just as pervasive. And, to say, and this is whatever, but like on Instagram, for example, when we post stuff about Black women being killed or Black men, people repost it or cis Black women and cis Black men repost it and, go hard. When we post about Black trans people, it is like shocking and maybe not shocking or, shocking, but maybe not surprising that it just does not, people do not. And those are the listeners, right? Those are the folks who are listening right now. Like, how I don't understand the difference in being so ready to fight for Black cis lives, but when it comes to Black trans people or trans people in general and non-binary folks, non-conforming folks, like that same energy and that same momentum is like nowhere to be found.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think like in the same way that we talk about the liberation of Black people is also tied to the liberation of immigrants and kids in cages. Like the liberation of Black people has to include the liberation of trans Black people, right? And and femmes and queer folks and for the Latinx and non-Black Latinx community too, right? Like homophobia is still super real. Like I feel like at my age now, I those ants that Yaz was referencing, the Trump supporters, they were also the ones that told me I was going to go to hell when I came out, 10 years ago.
They're
and
consistent.
So it's like, they have stayed true to message. Yes, at least I know there's no surprises from them anymore. I can expect hatred at full force, but in that same vein, right? Like you can't talk about racial justice without talking about how gender plays into that. And I'm not just talking, when we say gender, we don't just mean cis women, but also like trans and non-binary people. And I think absolutely we have a lot of work to do within our own communities, right? Of addressing that. So I wanted to make sure we made some space for that conversation.
Yeah. Because and just to plug in a little bit to that is like, I've seen a lot of folks who are moderate, which I don't even know what that means, but it's just like, okay, it just means you're floating around in the air somewhere. But that are more like I don't know, can't pick a side, can't put a foot, no está ni aquí ni de allá, right? So essentially, I feel like those people love to embrace like the Old Navy Target LGBT brand of like a rainbow, right?
Oh yeah.
And they're like all about like
Totally.
we love the gays, we're gonna go to Pride.
Love is love.
Yeah, love is love. Like
love not hate.
Love hate, yeah.
With an 8.
Like all that shit.
Yeah.
Right.
On the face.
Right. And I feel like one, those folks are almost always talking about white gay cis men, right?
Yeah.
And 2 are almost always super transphobic, and 3 are at the same time, and this is like my own ethnography on my Facebook feed, but like are also like the people that are having issues with the way Black folks are protesting, or the way that the protests are being held, or whatever. The ones that like to call out like looters and rioters, right?
Yeah.
I'm like, do you understand that the way you get to have your little fake ass moment and your Instagram picture with your stupid Old Navy t-shirt that has a rainbow on it, like, is because of trans Black women?
Right.
Like, can we talk about that? Like, I mean,
yes.
I know, like, with y'all 3, I'm preaching to the choir, but for those that are listening, like, what the, like, where the hell did you think all of this started? Did you think that, thank you so much. Like, did you think that, like, Pride started because somebody was like, here you go, baby. This is for you now.
Right.
It's like your right to polyester is because of Black and brown trans women.
Okay.
And everyone deserves the right, I guess, if you're trying to go for polyester, but you know.
I mean, it's not breathable, so if you're going to wear it to a protest, girl, good luck.
Right. Yes. And it's June, so thank you for the reminder that Pride was a riot.
It was.
Right.
Pride was a riot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Rainbow capitalism.
And don't come at me with but you guys can get married now. Like, I will.
Who gives a fuck? Yeah.
I'm like, bitch, you want to get married just so you can get divorced? Get the fuck out of here.
Right. I'm all,
so pissed. Now I'm mad.
Right. I'm all, that's not a gift.
That's a burden that now I have an option to participate in.
I used to be able to just be like, oh, it's not for me. I can't do it. And now I'm like, fuck. Yeah.
Yeah.
We digress, but
but we have a long way to go, right? In the Latinx community. Like, I think that is such an interesting intersection of like what both of our podcasts represent, right? That we're speaking to young, I hope, I don't know, young is a relative word in my family. I have a 17-year-old sister who says I'm ancient, but you know, like we're talking to young millennial age, LGBT identified or ally folks. So like they know that there's this problem, but what are you doing about the homophobia in our community that's preventing folks from seeing the humanity, the full humanity of like Black trans women being killed at a disproportionate rate? And so I think that's what, that's like advanced level, like gymnastics to play with your family, right? Like to really think, okay, like George Floyd, we know that name, we're very aware of it. What about, you know, Nina Pop? What about Dominique Remy Fells? Like, what about these women that have been murdered brutally that we're not talking about with the same energy, like Seb was saying? So yeah, like that's the kind of conversation, you know, if people don't associate you with the Mariah Carey meme, the Thanksgiving one, then what are you doing? You know, if people don't kind of grimace a little when you come to the family dinner, then
Seb and I are all.
I know. We're notorious. They're like, uh-oh, here they come.
Yes.
We're just going to play Uno. We're all, no, you're not.
Nope. Not today. Not on my anti-capitalist watch.
Unless it's white supremacy Uno, then.
Yeah.
I'm all, this is genocide. Get the fuck out of here with that stupid ass meal. But anyways.
But we digress. Yeah, so I think those are, you know, these are not new for those that listen to us. You know that these are things that we talk about. And I think the focus on these conversations around talking about race and specifically Blackness and anti-Blackness and racism is because, you know, like the energy of the moment, despite the violence and the tragedy and trauma that is also happening simultaneously, is like, I think, the perfect time to open up those conversations, right? And I think that you need to be okay not getting the answer you want at first. I think you need to be okay getting resistance from the folks that you're talking to. I think you need to be okay with it being so uncomfortable that you might not want to talk to that person for a little bit, right? Like I at least, and I'm speaking from experience, because I for a long time was like, but they're my tias, and like they used to take us out to do fun things when we were little, and now they're telling me I'm gonna burn in hell. Like, you know what I mean? So yeah, it is hard, and it's not supposed to be easy. And I think the other thing I will say is that, like, if you've been doing it and trying and you're still not getting through to them, it's okay to let that go, I think. It's okay to say, you know what, this is not worth putting my energy if I've done everything I could. Maybe there are other like people who have more open ears and open hearts who will receive this, or at least dialogue with it in ways that are not just shutting it out. So I just wanted to like make sure I said that, so that you're not also putting the weight of the world on yourself.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to like, if like that then falls on that person, right? If that person, like, we can't control how people receive the message, right? We can't control how if people are open to the message, or we can't control if people decide to change or not. Like, ultimately, especially with families, right? Like, because that can be sometimes really frustrating and draining, right? And so I think if you're doing that work and you, as Seb's talking about, you feel like have already done everything that you can do, like, then that's no longer, and based, like, you can decide if you continue to stay in contact with that person or whatever, right? But again, like, that's out of your control at that point, right? That person at least knows where you stand. You're not staying silent, and you're on brand with you, right? Like, you've done everything that you can do. But for folks to say, and I've heard this, I heard somebody else share this about their white coworkers being like, but I never knew that it was this bad, or like, how was I supposed to know? Like, bitch, like, how are you supposed to know? Because everybody has Google. Like, everybody has fucking Google. Like, this specific person is somebody that has a computer, undergrad degree, a law degree. So, like, there's no fucking excuse just because you're not a black person or your person's white. Like, just because you're white doesn't mean that, like, you're absolved from, like, this is your history too, right? This is I've been thinking about this, right? Like, because I'm like, during February, we always talk, or not we, but like on the social media, it's like Black History Month, or it is Black History Month, right, nationally. But then on social media, it's like Black history is American history, right? It is U.S. history. And so we need to have it. And I'm like, damn, like, this for white people, it's like 2020 is Black History Year, you know? Because if you don't show up in February, you probably never show up in February, right? But like, now's the time to like, there's no fucking excuse anymore. So when it comes to family in general, it's like, it goes just back to our other conversation. Like, these things are inherent in the hierarchies that we were brought up with too, right? With those same, like, mira el negrito, güerito, like, all that shit. We carry that within us. And so, you know, it really is our job to do that work and speak on it and look at it internally, but also to call that shit out. And yeah, be that heckler at dinner.
Yeah.
Right. And you know, and find your people. Like, your people may not be your blood relatives, and that's okay. Find your people, because you need people to get through this. You need people to also, like, vent about how horrible it was, that conversation with your tia or whatever. Yeah. So unfortunately, we are wrapping up to the end of our hour here, but as always, we want to say thank you to Jack and Angélica of Anzaldúing It for joining us.
Thank you.
If you are listening to this one first, remember that the part 1 of this convo is on their podcast, so go check them out wherever you listen to podcasts to listen to that, and subscribe to them too, because they have a dope show. Is there anything you want to add before we sign off today?
No. Again, I feel like be patient with yourself, but also don't be patient enough that you choose to opt out of this. Because that's not an option. Absolutely. I love y'all, Angélica and Jack, and Seb too.
Love you.
Thanks.
Appreciate y'all so much for being on here and having this conversation with us.
Thank you so much.
I feel like we could record 10 more episodes.
I know,
right?
Maybe we will.
What are the next topics?
Don't tempt me.
Yaz, you want to take us out?
All right. Like we say, love yourself. I love your life.
And remember that you know more than you think you know. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.